Welcome back. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a like. Enjoy the video. A biker punched a 90-year-old veteran without realizing who his son was. Frank Johnson sat in his usual corner booth at the diner, his wrinkled hands cradling a steaming cup of black coffee. The faint aroma of bacon and eggs lingered in the air, mingling with the warm scent of maple syrup. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time. Checkered floors, vinyl seats, and a bell that jingled softly every time someone walked in. Frank liked it that way, simple and familiar. At 90 years old, he wasn't interested in change. He fought in the Korean War, faced death more times than he could count, and survived things most people couldn't imagine. After all that, a quiet breakfast and a cup of coffee felt like heaven. "Another refill, Mr. Johnson?" Ellie asked, holding a coffee pot in one hand and wiping her apron with the other. "Sure thing, Ellie," Frank replied, smiling at her. She was young, maybe 25, with tired eyes and a nervous energy that spoke of long shifts and too many responsibilities. "Busy morning as always," she said, pouring his coffee, especially since those guys started showing up. Frank raised an eyebrow. "What guys?" But before Ellie could answer, the rumble of motorcycles filled the parking lot outside. The sound vibrated through the diner's thin walls, rattling the silverware. Frank didn't even need to look. He could feel the shift in the room. The Iron Fangs. Everyone in town knew about them. A gang of bikers who had rolled in over the last year, taking over as if they owned the place. They weren't just loud and obnoxious, they were dangerous. The door swung open, and 4 men walked in, leather jackets, chain belts, tattoos covering their arms and necks. They sauntered in like they owned the diner. And maybe they did. Ellie flinched but kept her head down, wiping imaginary crumbs off the counter. Frank set his cup down and straightened his back. The leader stepped forward, a towering man with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down the side of his face. His name was Tank, a name that fit him too well. He didn't look like the kind of man who took no for an answer. "Morning, sweetheart," Tank said, smirking at Ellie. "Why don't you pour me some coffee and smile while you're at it?" Ellie didn't respond. She grabbed a cup and poured coffee, her hands trembling slightly. Frank didn't like bullies. Never had. Tank noticed Ellie's shaky hands and laughed. "What's wrong, darling? Afraid I might bite?" He leaned over the counter, inches from her face. Frank cleared his throat loud enough to be heard. The diner went silent. "Leave the girl alone," Frank said, his voice calm but steady. Tank turned slowly, as if he couldn't believe someone had spoken to him. He looked Frank up and down. The gray hair, the frail body, the old military cap. "Well, well," Tank said, grinning. "What do we have here? Grandpa wants to play hero." Frank didn't move. "I said leave her alone," Frank repeated. The gang chuckled. One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, stepped closer. "You got a death wish, old man?" Frank didn't flinch. "I've seen death before. You don't scare me." Tank's smile faded. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. "You don't know who you're talking to," Tank said, stepping forward until he loomed over Frank. "And you don't know who you're talking to," Frank shot back. For a moment, it seemed like Tank might back down, but then he laughed. A low, dangerous sound. And before Frank could react, Tank's fist shot out, catching him in the jaw. Frank stumbled back, crashing into the booth. Coffee spilled, plates shattered. Ellie screamed, but Frank didn't fall. He wiped the blood from his lip and stood up, his back as straight as it had been the day he enlisted. "Still standing," Frank said, his voice even. Hank's smile disappeared. He stepped closer, raising his fist again, but this time Ellie darted between them. "Stop!" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Just stop!" Tank lowered his fist but didn't move back. "Next time," he said, glaring at Frank, "stay in your seat, old man." The gang turned and walked out the door, the bell jingling behind them. Outside, the motorcycles roared to life. And just like that, they were gone. The diner was silent. Ellie knelt beside Frank, her hands shaking. "Are you okay?" Frank nodded. "I've had worse." But the truth was his jaw throbbed, and humiliation burned hotter than the pain. He didn't mind taking a punch. It wasn't the first time. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his town, and he'd just been humiliated in front of the people he cared about. He couldn't let it go. Reaching into his pocket, Frank pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Marcus," he said, "I need your help." There was a pause. "What happened, Dad?" Frank looked out the window, watching the trail of dust left by the bikers. "They messed with the wrong man." Frank sat on the edge of his recliner, the throbbing in his jaw a dull reminder of the morning's humiliation. His old bones ached, but none of it compared to the fire burning inside him. He'd faced down enemies with rifles, grenades, and tanks, yet here he was, beaten by a bunch of punks with bad tattoos and louder mouths than sense. The living room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the television. The volume was low, playing the evening news, but Frank wasn't listening. His mind was still in the diner, replaying the punch, the laughter, and Ellie's frightened eyes. And then there was Marcus. He'd barely gotten through the phone call before Marcus cut him off, promising to be there in minutes. Frank hadn't told him much, just enough to let his son know something had gone wrong. But Marcus didn't need the details. He always knew when something wasn't right. It was barely 15 minutes later when Frank heard the sharp knock on the door. "Dad?" Marcus's voice was deep and commanding, the kind of voice that made people sit up and listen whether they wanted to or not. Frank had always been proud of that. Marcus hadn't just grown up. He'd become a leader. Frank opened the door, and there he was. Marcus stood tall, his police uniform crisp and his badge gleaming in the dim light. At 40, he had his father's sharp jawline, but broader shoulders, and a confidence that only came from years of enforcing the law. His eyes, dark and sharp, immediately zeroed in on the bruise forming along Frank's jaw. What the hell happened? Quote. Frank stepped aside, letting Marcus in. "It's nothing." "That's not nothing, Dad," Marcus said, his voice low but tight with barely controlled anger. He walked in, closing the door behind him. "Who did this?" Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he sank back into his recliner and rubbed his temples. "Bikers," he said finally. "The Iron Fangs." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "The Iron Fangs? The same gang I've been tracking for 6 months?" Frank blinked. "You've been tracking them?" "Yeah." Marcus crossed his arms. "I didn't say anything before because I didn't want to worry you, but they're involved in more than just intimidation. Drugs, stolen weapons, extortion. There's a lot going on under the surface." Frank's lips pressed into a thin line. "And they're running free?" "Not for long," Marcus said. "I've been building a case, but it's slow. I need evidence, and the locals are too scared to testify." "Well, they're not scared of me," Frank said, sitting up straighter. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Maybe not, but they should be scared of me." Marcus's car rolled into the parking lot of the diner later that evening. The lot was nearly empty except for Ellie's rusted hatchback and a few others. The neon open sign buzzed faintly, its glow barely illuminating the cracked pavement. Inside, Ellie looked up, her face instantly breaking into relief when she saw Marcus in uniform. "Oh, thank God," she said, rushing over. "Marcus, you have to do something. Those guys." "Ellie," Marcus said, holding up a hand to calm her. "Tell me everything." Ellie's voice shook as she described what had happened. The punch, the threats, the way Tank and his crew had laughed as they left, promising to come back when it was more fun. "They've been coming in more often," she said, her voice breaking. "They act like they own this place. I've tried calling the police before, but nothing ever happens." Marcus's eyes darkened. "It'll happen now." At the police station. Marcus spread out the Iron Fangs file across the briefing table. Photos, reports, and crime scene evidence littered the surface. Detective Reed, his right-hand man, leaned over the table, flipping through the documents. "These guys are bad news," Reed said. "We got reports of intimidation, vandalism, even a couple of suspicious fires, but no one's willing to testify." "They're too scared," Marcus said. "A gang's built a reputation on fear. What's our move, Chief?" Marcus's jaw clenched. "We hit them where it hurts. Start pulling surveillance footage from every street corner and business they've touched. Cross-check it with our records. If we can't nail them for what happened to my dad, we'll take them down for something worse." "And what about Tank?" Reed asked. Marcus's eyes gleamed. "I'll handle him personally." The next morning, Frank was sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee when he saw Marcus's squad car pull up. "Got any leads?" Frank asked, setting his cup down. "Plenty," Marcus said, stepping out of the car. "But I need you to let me handle this." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Let you handle it?" "Yes, Dad. I don't need you getting mixed up in this. They already targeted you. Next time it could be worse." Frank stood slowly, his gaze hard. "I've been through worse," he said. "I know," Marcus said, softening. "But this time you're not alone." Frank looked at his son, seeing the same determination he'd once had in his younger days. It made him proud, but it also made him worried. "Just promise me one thing," Frank said. "What's that?" "Don't let anger make you reckless." Marcus nodded, but the fire in his eyes said it wouldn't be that simple. That afternoon, Marcus parked his squad car outside the Iron Fangs clubhouse, a converted auto shop on the outskirts of town. He didn't need backup. Not yet. This was personal. Tank and his crew were sitting outside, their bikes gleaming in the sunlight. "Well, look who it is," Tank said, standing up. "You lost, officer?" "Pomquo." Marcus didn't flinch. "No," he said, stepping closer. "But you are." Tank's smile faded. "Stay away from my father," Marcus said, his voice cold and sharp. "You don't know who you're messing with." Tank's eyes flickered, but he didn't back down. "And what are you going to do if I don't?" Marcus leaned in. "You'll find out." For the first time, Tank looked unsure, but he covered it quickly with a grin. "Careful, Chief. You might start something you can't finish." Marcus didn't smile. "Oh, I always finish what I start." Marcus Johnson leaned back in his office chair, his eyes fixed on the files spread across his desk. The Iron Fangs weren't just some ragtag group of bikers causing petty trouble. The more Marcus dug into their activities, the more dangerous they appeared. Drug trafficking, extortion, illegal weapons, and now assaulting a 90-year-old veteran, his father, his fists. He clenched his fists as the image of Frank's bruised face flashed through his mind. The Iron Fangs had no idea who they had messed with. Not yet. Chief Marcus looked up to see Detective Reed stepping into his office, carrying a stack of papers and a USB drive. "You're going to want to see this." Marcus gestured for him to come in. "Tell me you've got something." Reed dropped the stack of papers onto the desk and plugged the USB drive into Marcus's computer. Within seconds, surveillance footage from various businesses near the diner popped up on the screen. "Check this out," Reed said, clicking through the videos. "This one's from the gas station across the street from the diner. Look who's loitering outside just before the attack." The grainy video showed Tank and his gang smoking and laughing as they leaned against their bikes. It was just minutes before they walked into the diner and confronted Frank. "They weren't just passing through," Marcus said, his voice low. "They were waiting." "Exactly." Reed fast-forwarded the footage. "Watch this." The next clip showed Tank pulling a small bag from his jacket and handing it to another man in a pickup truck that had pulled into the lot. "Money exchanged hands drugs," Marcus said, "most likely." Reed replied. "And that's not all. We checked their clubhouse last night. Got eyes on a stockpile of weapons, sawn-off shotguns, handguns, even grenades." Marcus's jaw tightened. "These guys aren't just bullies. They're building an arsenal." Reed nodded. "And we're outgunned unless we shut them down now." Marcus stood, his mind already racing through scenarios. "No," he said. "Not yet. We don't have enough to bring them all in. If we rush this and it falls apart, they'll just scatter, regroup, and come back stronger." Reed frowned. "So what's the plan?" Marcus's lips curled into a grim smile. "We don't just take them down. We dismantle them." The following evening, Marcus parked down the street from the Iron Fangs clubhouse. It was an old, run-down auto shop covered in graffiti and shielded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. Inside, the faint glow of neon lights and the muffled sound of rock music spilled out onto the deserted street. Beside him, Officer Carloon adjusted her earpiece and checked her sidearm. She was one of Marcus's most trusted officers, known for her no-nonsense attitude and quick thinking. "You sure about this, Chief?" Carla asked. "They've got eyes everywhere." "That's the point," Marcus replied, his voice steady. Let them see us. Make them nervous. Quote dot. Their job wasn't to raid the clubhouse. Not yet. Tonight was about surveillance and planting the seeds of doubt. Marcus stepped out of the car, keeping his posture straight and confident. Carla followed as they approached the gate. One of the bikers leaned out, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Well, look who's here," the biker sneered. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to show up again, Chief." Quote dot. "Funny," Marcus said, resting his hand casually on his holstered gun. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." Quote dot. The biker smirked, faltering. "We're just here to talk," Marcus said. "Tell your boss to come out." Quote dot. The biker hesitated, but after a moment, he disappeared inside. Minutes later, Tank emerged, his leather vest unzipped, revealing tattoos across his chest that looked as menacing as the man himself. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon, Chief," Tank said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's the occasion? Missing your old man already?" Marcus's eyes didn't waver. "You made a mistake," Marcus said, "and now I'm going to fix it." Quote dot. Tank's grin widened. "Words from a cop who hasn't done a damn thing yet." Quote dot. Marcus stepped closer. So close that Tank's grin faltered. "You've got 24 hours, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a growl. "Clear out, because next time I come back, it won't be for a chat." Quote dot. Tank's eyes darkened, but he didn't respond. Marcus turned and walked away, but he could feel their stares burning into his back. Good. Let them stew. Meanwhile, back at his house, Frank wasn't waiting around. He had spent the day reinforcing his home, securing the doors, installing locks, and setting up motion detectors in the yard. He even dug his old army knife out of storage and practiced holding it steady. His hands might have been old, but they were still strong. Ellie stopped by to check on him, bringing dinner and a worried expression. "Johnson, you really need to let Marcus handle this." Quote dot. "He's doing his part," Frank said. "I'm doing mine." Quote dot. "But what if they come back? Then they'll regret it." Quote dot. Ellie frowned but didn't argue further. She knew better than to try changing Frank's mind when it was set. Later that night, Marcus and his team set up hidden cameras and motion sensors near the clubhouse, tracking every move the bikers made. But the gang was already making their next move. Tank wasn't just angry, he was paranoid, and paranoia made men dangerous. Inside the clubhouse, Tank paced while his men drank and smoked. "We can't let them push us around," he growled. "We hit back hard." Snake, his second in command, looked uneasy. "Chief Johnson's no joke, Tank. He's ex-FBI. He's already got enough on us to make it stick." Quote dot. "Not if we shut him down first." Quote dot. "What do you mean?" Tank grinned, his teeth glinting in the dim light. "We go after what he cares about most." Snake's eyes widened. "His old man?" Back at his home, Frank sat by the window, the baseball bat resting against his chair. The night was quiet. But Frank knew better than to trust it. And as the clock ticked past midnight, he saw them, 2 motorcycles pulling up down the street, their headlights off. Frank didn't flinch. He just stood, picked up the bat, and prepared for whatever came next. The bikers weren't even trying to be subtle. They wanted him to know they were there, watching, waiting. Frank's eyes flickered to the mantel above the fireplace, where a row of faded medals and ribbons sat in a dusted display case. The memories they carried were heavier than the bat in his hand. He'd survived bullets, grenades, and ambushes. He wasn't about to let a couple of punks with loud engines and bad tattoos scare him. Still, his heart pounded harder than he wanted to admit. It wasn't fear for himself, it was fear for Marcus. Frank's son didn't back down, and that was what worried him. Marcus might have the badge and the authority, but these men didn't play by the rules. They didn't care about the law, and neither did Frank. Not anymore. He stepped closer to the window, peering through the blinds. The 2 bikers hadn't moved, but one of them flicked a cigarette onto the pavement and ground it out with his boot. Frank exhaled sharply. "Testing me, are you?" He set the bat down carefully against the wall and reached for the shotgun he pulled out earlier. The feel of the cold steel against his fingers steadied him. He hadn't fired a weapon in years, but the motions came back like muscle memory. He loaded the shells, locked the action, and waited. Meanwhile, at the police station, Marcus stood at the head of the briefing room, his eyes scanning the faces of his team. Officers sat around the table, their notebooks open, pens poised, waiting for his orders. "This ends now," Marcus said, his voice sharp. "The Iron Fangs think they can intimidate this town, but we're not playing defense anymore. We're pushing back." Detective Reed stepped forward and pinned photos and maps to the board behind Marcus. Each pin marked a suspected safe house, weapon stash, or drug deal location. "We've tracked their movements for the last 48 hours, Reed said. "They're spreading out, but we've identified 3 key targets: their clubhouse, a warehouse on the east side, and a garage near the train yard." Marcus nodded. "We hit them fast, hit them hard, and make sure there's nowhere for them to regroup." "Chief," Officer Carloon interrupted, "what about your father? If they know you're coming, he's still a target." The question hit Marcus like a gut punch. Frank wasn't just a victim in this mess, he was bait, and Marcus knew it. "I've already got officers patrolling his street," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. He'll be safe." But as soon as the words left his mouth, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was Frank. "Dad," Marcus answered quickly, stepping out of the room. "They're here," Frank said, his voice low but calm. Marcus's blood ran cold. "Who's there?" "Two of them," Frank replied, sitting outside, watching. "Stay inside," Marcus said, already grabbing his keys and motioning for Reed to follow. "I'm on my way." "Don't worry about me," Frank said. "Just hurry." The line went dead. Marcus's car screeched to a halt in front of Frank's house minutes later, lights flashing as he and Reed stepped out. The bikers gunned their engines and sped off into the night. "Cowards," Reed muttered. But Marcus wasn't listening. He sprinted up the front steps and burst into the house. "Dad!" now. Frank stepped out from the shadows, the shotgun still in his hands. "You took your time," Frank said, lowering the weapon. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you doing with that?" "Protecting myself." "You shouldn't," Frank interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't tell me what I should or shouldn't do. You think this is my first time staring down an enemy?" Marcus froze. He saw it then. The fire in his father's eyes, the unshakable resolve of a soldier who had fought too many battles to back down now. "This isn't Vietnam, Dad. Feels like it." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. "It's not," he said firmly, "because I won't let it turn into one. I promise." Frank looked at his son for a long moment and finally nodded. "All right," he said, "but if they come back, you better make damn sure they regret it." The next morning, the town buzzed with rumors. The Iron Fangs had been seen riding through the streets, their presence heavier than ever. Some said they were looking for revenge. Others said they were gearing up for something bigger. At the diner, Ellie nervously cleaned the counter, while customers whispered about the bikers and the police. She jumped when the doorbell jingled, only to relax when Frank stepped inside. "Mr. Johnson," she said, relief flooding her voice. "Are you okay?" Frank nodded and took his usual seat. "They're not done," he said. "Not yet." Ellie's face paled. "What do we do?" Frank looked her in the eye. "We stand our ground." That night, Marcus gathered his officers outside the Iron Fangs clubhouse. Dressed in bulletproof vests and armed to the teeth, they were ready to move. Inside the clubhouse, Tank was fuming. "That old man is still walking around," he spat. "Not for long." Snake shifted nervously. "Chief Johnson's got his eyes on us. We should lay low." "No," Tank snapped. "We hit back hard." "What about his kid?" Tank grinned. "We take him out first." That night, Marcus gathered his officers outside the Iron Fangs clubhouse. Dressed in bulletproof vests and armed to the teeth, they were ready to move. Inside the clubhouse, Tank was fuming. "That old man is still walking around," he spat. "Not for long." Snake shifted nervously. "Chief Johnson's got his eyes on us. We should lay low." "No," Tank snapped. "We hit back hard." This time for real. Frank Johnson stood at his living room window, the shotgun resting against his chair. Outside, the night was heavy and silent, but he knew better than to trust the calm. He could feel it coming. The Iron Fangs weren't the type to let humiliation slide. Tank's punch wasn't just an attack. It was a message. And now Frank was certain they were planning to send another one. Only this time, it wouldn't just be a warning. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and Frank reached for it quickly. "Marcus?" He listened carefully. Marcus's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Something sharp and urgent. "We have a situation. I need you to lock the doors and stay inside. Quote, dot." Frank frowned. "What's going on?" "There's movement at the clubhouse. They're gathering. I've got officers watching the roads, but it looks like they're splitting up. Quote, dot." Frank's grip on the phone tightened. "You think they're coming here?" "I don't think, Dad. I know. Quote, dot." "Let them come," Frank said, his voice steady. "No," Marcus snapped. "I mean it. Stay inside. I'm on my way. Quote, dot." But even as Marcus said the words, Frank's gut told him that time wasn't on their side. Marcus sped down the dark road, his siren silent but his lights flashing. Detective Reed was in the passenger seat, checking his sidearm for the third time. "You sure about this, Chief?" Reed asked. This feels rushed. What if they're trying to lure us out?" "They are," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Facts. But it doesn't matter. My dad's in the crosshairs, and I'm not waiting for them to make the first move. Quote, dot." Reed exhaled sharply and nodded. Marcus's phone buzzed again. It was Officer Carloon. "Chief!" Her voice came through the speaker. "We got movement near the East Warehouse. 3 bikes and a van. It looks like they're heading toward the train yard. Quote, dot." Marcus's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. "That's too far from my dad's house," he said. "They're trying to split our forces. Hold your position and don't engage until I give the order. Quote, dot." "Yes, sir. Quote, dot." Marcus hung up and pressed harder on the gas pedal. "Roxas, they're smarter than I thought," Reed muttered. "We might be walking into a trap." Marcus glanced at him. "We're not the ones walking into a trap. Quote, dot." At Frank's house, the motion lights flickered to life in the front yard. Frank grabbed his shotgun and took position by the window. Moments later, 3 motorcycles and a black truck rolled up, their engines growling. The lead biker dismounted first. It wasn't Tank. It was Snake, his second in command. The younger man stepped forward, his leather jacket glinting under the lights. "Hey. Hey, old man," Snake shouted. "Why don't you come outside so we can talk?" Frank didn't move. Snake took another step closer, grinning. "You think your son's gonna save you? He's not here. It's just you and us now. Quote, dot." Frank raised the shotgun, the barrel gleaming through the blinds. "I don't need saving," he said, loud enough to be heard. Snake's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You really think poking that thing is gonna stop us?" he said, gesturing to the other bikers. "Come on, Frank. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Quote, dot." Frank's finger rested lightly on the trigger. "I suggest you turn around," Frank said, his voice like steel, "because if you take one more step, you're not walking away. Quote, dot." The tension snapped. Snake lunged toward the porch, and Frank pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, shattering the silence. Snake dove for cover as the blast tore through the wooden railing, splinters flying everywhere. The bikers scattered, cursing. But Frank didn't flinch. He reloaded and aimed again. The flashing lights of Marcus's cruiser appeared down the street just as the bikers started to regroup. The sound of the siren cut through the chaos, forcing Snake and the others to hesitate. Marcus hit the brakes hard, stepping out with his weapon drawn. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground," he shouted. Snake sneered but didn't move. "I said down!" Marcus's voice was sharp and commanding. One of the bikers tried to run, but Reed tackled him, pinning him to the ground, and another reached for a weapon, but Marcus fired a warning shot into the dirt. "I won't ask again." Quote, dot. Reluctantly, the bikers complied, dropping their knives and chains before getting down on their knees. Frank stepped onto the porch, his shotgun still in hand. "You okay, Dad?" Marcus called out, his eyes scanning the scene. Frank nodded. "Told you I didn't need saving." Marcus couldn't help but grin. Just when it seemed like the situation was under control, a gunshot rang out. Everyone froze. Marcus spun toward the source and saw Tank emerging from the alley, a gun in his hand. Jally. "Drop it!" Tank shouted, aiming his weapon at Marcus. But Tank wasn't aiming at Marcus. He was aiming at Frank. "No!" Marcus shouted. "Frank!" Frank dove behind the porch railing. Tank fired. The bullet shattered the wooden post, sending debris flying. Marcus didn't hesitate. He fired back, hitting Tank's shoulder. The biker fell, his weapon clattering to the ground. But Marcus wasn't finished. He sprinted toward Tank and tackled him before he could reach for the gun again. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Marcus growled, pinning Tank to the ground. Blood seeped through Tank's jacket, but he laughed. A deep, bitter sound. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you won? You don't know who you're dealing with." The wail of sirens filled the air as backup finally arrived. Officers poured into the yard, quickly subduing the remaining bikers. Marcus stood, his breath ragged, as Tank was hauled to his feet and coughed. Frank approached, his shotgun resting on his shoulder. "You all right, son?" Marcus looked at his father and smiled weakly. "Yeah," he said. "Thanks to you." Frank clapped him on the shoulder. "Told you I wasn't done fighting." By dawn, the train yard was locked down. The cartel's weapons and drugs were confiscated, and the iron fangs were officially broken. Marcus stood with Reed, surveying the scene. "This goes deeper than we thought," Reed said. "The cartel's still out there." Marcus nodded. "We'll deal with them one step at a time." Frank approached, wiping dirt from his hands. "What's next?" he asked. Marcus looked at his father, the warrior who had refused to stand down, and smiled. "We rebuild," he said, "and then we finish this." The night's battle at the train yard had ended, but Frank knew the war wasn't over. The Iron Fangs were shattered, their leader Tank in custody. Yet the words "Tank hissed before being dragged away" still echoed in Frank's mind. "You don't even know who you're really fighting." Frank didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. Tank wasn't the top of the food chain. The cartel was still out there, pulling strings, and they wouldn't take the loss lightly. The sound of a car engine pulled him out of his thoughts. Marcus's police cruiser rolled up, kicking gravel as it stopped in front of the house. Frank immediately knew something was wrong. Marcus stepped out, his face tight with exhaustion, his shirt rumpled, and his sidearm strapped to his hip even though his shift was supposed to be over. "Dad," Marcus called as he climbed the steps. "What is it?" "Who?" Frank asked, skipping the pleasantries. "They hit one of the safe houses we raided last night." Marcus's voice was sharp, but there was an edge of disbelief. "It was torched. The evidence, the drugs, everything we confiscated, gone." Frank's eyes darkened. "The cartel." "Yeah." Marcus ran a hand through his hair. "And that's not all. 2 of our guys are missing. They were guarding the warehouse." "The cartel either bought them off or worse." Frank cursed under his breath. "They're cleaning house, making sure nothing leads back to them." Marcus nodded. "We were too close. Now they're pushing back." Hours later, at the police station, Marcus stood in the briefing room, staring at the surveillance footage from the torched warehouse. Smoke and flames filled the screen, but something else caught his attention. A black SUV appeared briefly at the edge of the frame, its tinted windows obscuring the driver. "Pause that," Marcus said, pointing. Reed froze the footage. "That SUV," Marcus muttered. "Enhance it." Reed zoomed in, clarifying the grainy image. On the back window, barely visible, was a cartel insignia, a red scorpion. "Damn it," Reed said. "We've got cartel hitters in town, and they're not here to negotiate." Marcus replied. Back at home, Frank was cleaning his shotgun when he heard a knock at the door. He frowned. Nobody knocked anymore. People either called or shouted from the yard. When he opened the door, his eyes narrowed. A woman stood there. She was tall, slender, and dressed in a black leather jacket. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and something about the way she carried herself set off alarm bells in Frank's head. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice smooth, arduous. "I was hoping we could talk." Quote, dot. Frank didn't move. "Who are you?" Quote, "Isabel Vargas," she said, stepping closer. "I represent some interested parties." Quote, dot. Frank didn't need her to spell it out. "The cartel?" Quote. Isabel smiled. "You're smarter than most." Frank gripped the shotgun a little tighter, but Isabel raised her hands in mock surrender. "Relax," she said. "I'm just here to talk." Quote, dot. "Then talk," Frank snapped. Your son's pushing too hard," Isabel said, her voice cool but sharp. "The people I work for don't like pressure. They want this to go away, and so do I." Frank's eyes never left hers. "What are you offering?" "A deal," Isabel replied. "Your son backs off, stops his investigation, and nobody gets hurt." Quote, dot. Frank let out a low laugh. "You think you can scare me with threats? I've been shot at by better men than you." Quote, dot. Isabel's expression hardened. "This isn't Korea, old man. It's 2024, and we don't leave loose ends." Quote, dot. Frank took a deliberate step forward, forcing her to back up. "Tell your bosses," he said, voice like steel, "that they messed with the wrong family." Isabel's eyes flickered, but she didn't argue. Instead, she pulled a burner phone from her pocket and placed it on the porch railing. "Think it over," she said. "Call me before this gets ugly." Quote, dot. Then she turned and walked away. Frank stared at the phone for a long moment before crushing it under his boot. That night, Marcus sat with Frank at the kitchen table. Plans, maps, and blueprints were scattered across the surface. "She came to the house?" Marcus asked, his jaw tightening. Frank nodded. "Made it clear they're not done." Marcus slammed his fist on the table. "I'm tired of being on defense. We need to end this." Quote, dot. Frank leaned back. "Then we draw them in." Quote, dot. Marcus frowned. "How?" Frank's eyes gleamed. "We make them think we're scared, like we're giving up. Set up a fake evidence drop at the old steel mill. We leak the location and make it look like we're stashing everything we have left there. And when they show up," Frank's smile was cold, "we make sure they don't leave." Quote, dot. The next morning, Marcus leaked the location of the evidence stash through a corrupt informant. By nightfall, the bait had been set. Frank and Marcus, along with Detective Carloon, took up positions inside the mill. The air was thick with dust and the scent of rust. Frank sat on a crate, shotgun in hand. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked. Frank smirked. "Are they?" Just after midnight, the sound of tires on gravel echoed through the mill. Frank peered through a crack in the wall, spotting 3 SUVs and at least 10 men armed with assault rifles. Isabel Vargas stepped out first, her cold gaze scanning the area. Marcus clicked his radio. "Wait for my signal." Quote, dot. The cartel enforcers moved toward the mill, spreading out. Frank exhaled. "Let's show them what happens when you push the wrong family," he said. Marcus gave the signal. The floodlights snapped on. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the mill as the police unit moved in. Marcus's men fired warning shots, driving the cartel into the opens. Frank didn't hesitate. He fired, dropping one of the enforcers trying to flank them. The firefight raged, but the cartel was unprepared for the tactical precision of Marcus's team and the ruthless determination of Frank. Isabel tried to retreat, but Frank caught her at the edge of the mill, shotgun raised. "No more deals," he said. She surrendered. The smoke from the firefight at the steel mill still lingered in the air as officers finished rounding up the surviving cartel enforcers. Marcus stood near the shattered entrance, his eyes scanning the scene while his heart pounded like a war drum. Frank sat on an overturned crate nearby, his shotgun resting across his lap. His breathing was heavy, but his grip on the weapon never loosened. The old soldier wasn't ready to relax just yet, not while the real threat still loomed in the shadows. Marcus's radio crackled. "Chief," Detective Reed's voice came through. "We've secured Isabel Vargas and her men. No casualties on our side." Marcus exhaled, his jaw still tight. "Good work, Reed. Get Vargas into custody. I'll handle the interrogation personally." Quote, dot. Frank shifted in his seat. You think she'll talk?" Marcus nodded grimly. She doesn't have a choice. But I don't think she's the one pulling the strings. She's just another pawn. Quote, dot. Frank's eyes narrowed. Then we better find out who's playing the game. Quote, dot. An hour later, Isabel Vargas sat in the small, dimly lit interrogation room at the police station. Her hands were cuffed, and despite the bloodstains on her jacket and dirt smudging her face, she sat tall, her demeanor unbroken. Marcus stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He tossed a file onto the table, letting the papers scatter. Photos of guns, drugs, and bodies spilled out in front of her. You're finished, Marcus said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. Isabel smirked. Am I? Or did you just step into something bigger than you realize? Marcus leaned forward. Bigger? You mean your cartel boss? The one who left you here to burn while he made his escape? Her smirk faltered just slightly, but she recovered. You don't understand how this works, Chief. You win a battle, but the war never ends. Cut off one head, and another grows back. Quote, dot. Not this time. Marcus reached into the file and pulled out a photo of Tank in handcuffs. Your biker buddy is already singing like a bird, Marcus said. He's given us names, routes, and even the dirty politicians who let you operate in this town. Quote, dot. Isabel's eyes flickered. Panic, anger, and frustration flashing for just a second before her mask returned. You think locking me up solves anything? She said. They'll send someone worse. And next time, you won't see them coming. Quote, dot. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. Then we'll be ready. Quote, dot. Marcus stepped out of the interrogation room, closing the door behind him. Reed and Carloon were waiting outside. She's stonewalling, Marcus said, but she's scared. I can feel it. Reed frowned. Should we push harder? Not yet. Let her stew. Quote, dot. But before Marcus could say more, Carloon's phone buzzed. She answered it quickly, but her face paled as she listened. What is it? Marcus asked. Carla hung up and looked at him. It's Councilman Crane, she said. He just posted bail for one of Isabel's men. Quote, one of the shooters? Quote. Marcus's blood boiled. Bail after what just happened? Cool. Reed swore under his breath. We knew Crane was dirty, but he's throwing his weight around. Quote, dot. Marcus turned to his father. Looks like it, but I'm done playing by their rules. Quote, dot. That night, Marcus and Reed sat outside Jeffrey Crane's estate. Their car parked in the shadows of the tall hedges. The sprawling mansion stood like a fortress, its lights glowing through massive windows. Are you sure about this? Reed asked. Marcus adjusted his bulletproof vest. I'm sure Crane's the key. We lean on him hard enough, and he'll crack. Quote, dot. Frank's voice suddenly came over the radio from his position nearby. I see movement. Black SUVs pulling into the driveway. It's the cartel, Marcus cursed. They're covering their tracks. If Crane flips, they'll bury him before he can talk. Quote, dot. Reed checked his weapon, preferring fleet. Then we can't let them get to him first. Marcus and Reed moved fast, cutting through the hedges and slipping toward the back entrance of the mansion. Frank stayed outside, covering the perimeter. Inside, the air was tense. Marcus heard muffled voices upstairs. Crane's panicked tone and another voice low and menacing. As Marcus crept up the staircase, a voice grew clearer. You think you can just walk away? Quote. The cartel enforcer grabbed him. You took our money, and now you're a liability. Quote, dot. Crane stammered, his voice shaking. I can fix this. I just need more time. Quote, dot. No more time, the enforcer said. Marcus kicked the door open. Drop the gun, he shouted. The enforcer turned, aiming his weapon, but Marcus fired first. The bullet hit the man's shoulder, sending him sprawling. Crane fell back, trembling, as Marcus stepped closer. You're coming with me, Marcus said, grabbing him by the collar. You don't understand, Crane pleaded. They'll kill me. Quote, dot. Not if we take them down first. Quote, dot. Outside, Frank's sharp eyes spotted two more cartel enforcers moving toward the house. They got backup. Frank barked into the radio. Marcus pushed Crane toward Reed. Get him out of here! Frank raised his shotgun, firing a warning shot as the enforcers ducked for cover. Move! Frank shouted. Marcus and Reed ran toward the car with Crane, while Frank provided cover fire. Bullets pinged off the walls and fences, but Frank stood his ground. By the time Marcus reached the car, sirens filled the air. Backup had finally arrived. The cartel men scattered, and his officers swarmed the property, locking it down. Frank finally lowered his shotgun, breathing hard but steady. By dawn, Councilman Crane was in protective custody, and his testimony was enough to secure federal warrants against the cartel's leadership. Marcus stood with Frank outside the police station, exhaustion hanging on both of them. "It's not over," Marcus said. "This was just one branch of the cartel. There's more out there." Frank nodded. "There always is, but at least now they know what we're capable of," Marcus added. Frank smiled faintly. "And what happens when you mess with the Johnson family?" Frank Johnson leaned against the hood of Marcus's cruiser, his worn hands gripping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The sun had climbed higher, bathing Riverstone in light, but the weight of the past few days still hung in the air. Marcus stood beside him, arms crossed, his badge glinting under the morning light. Both men were quiet, the kind of silence that spoke more than words ever could. Frank broke it first. "So what happens now?" Marcus exhaled, his gaze fixed on the police station's entrance, where Councilman Crane was being loaded into an unmarked federal van. "We wait," Marcus said. "Feds are handling the rest. Crane's testimony is solid enough to shut down the cartel's operation, at least for now." Frank nodded, though his expression didn't ease. "For now," he repeated. The steel mill was still being swept by federal agents. Crates of guns, drugs, and cash were cataloged and loaded into trucks. Evidence that would shut down supply lines and put men behind bars. Marcus had spent hours overseeing the process, but his thoughts kept drifting back to his father. Frank hadn't flinched. Not once. Not when bullets flew, and not when the cartel's thugs threatened their lives. Marcus had always known his father was tough. But this had been something else entirely. Frank was a fighter, and Marcus was proud to call him his father. That evening, Marcus drove Frank home. The old man stepped out of the cruiser, looking up at the porch he defended more than once in the last week. "Feels strange," Frank muttered as he stepped inside, the door creaking slightly. "What does?" Marcus asked, following him in. Frank set his shotgun back on the wall, its place now more ceremonial than defensive. "Not looking over my shoulder," Frank said, pouring himself a fresh cup of coffee. "I guess I got used to the fight." Marcus smiled faintly. "You don't have to fight anymore, Dad. It's over." Frank turned, meeting his son's eyes. "You sure about that?" Marcus paused. He wanted to say yes, to give his father the peace he deserved, but the truth, no. Marcus admitted not completely. "But we're ready if it isn't." Frank grinned. "Good answer." A week later, the town began to heal. Diana's diner reopened with a fresh coat of paint, and Tom Mason's hardware store had its windows replaced. People smiled more. They stayed out later. The shadows that had loomed over Riverstone had begun to lift. Frank saw it as he walked down Main Street, nodding to familiar faces and shaking hands with neighbors. "You're a hero, Frank," someone called out. Frank shook his head. "I'm just a stubborn old man," he replied. But as he turned the corner, he saw Ellie waiting for him by the park bench. "Stubborn men don't stand up to cartels," she said as he sat beside her. "They don't protect towns and save lives. They don't raise sons who become police chiefs." Frank smirked. But her words sank deeper than he let on. 2 days later, the federal agents left town, taking the cartel enforcers and evidence with them. The investigation continued, but Riverstone was no longer ground zero for violence and fear. Frank walked through the quiet streets one last time, watching kids ride their bikes and shopkeepers sweep their storefronts. He reminded himself of why he'd stayed all these years. Not for the land, not for the buildings, but for the people. And now, thanks to him and Marcus, they were safe. That night, Frank sat back on his porch, looking out at the street he defended. The shotgun leaned against the wall, not out of fear, but as a reminder. Marcus arrived as the stars came out, sitting beside him. Without saying a word, they didn't need to talk. The fight was over, and they'd won. But Frank knew trouble always came back, And when it did, the Johnson family would be ready. Here on Karma's Twists, we share the most impactful stories of karma and justice that the world needs to see. Don't miss a single moment of good triumphing over evil. Join our community and subscribe. Be part of the movement that believes justice always wins.